Hi everyone, and welcome to this chapter of the Free Full Stack course. In this chapter, we're going to set up our backend with Django. We're going to first go ahead and start creating a GitHub repository, and then we're going to create the backend code for it. And we're just going to set up the scaffold for the backend, so it's not that we're going to actually write our APIs in this chapter, but we're going to put everything in place and connect our backend with Postgres as well, so that we're ready in the following chapters in order to actually get into the API development. So let's go ahead in here and start creating a GitHub repository for our Django backend. I'm going to do some screen reshuffling in here. So let's go in here. I already have GitHub open. Now, I know, for me, I use GitHub, but for you, it may be different. Maybe you use Bitbucket or something else, but I think most of the watchers are using GitHub. So I'm assuming that the instructions are going to be applicable for pretty much anyone watching this video. So let's go ahead in here. As you can see in here, I'm in the create a new repository section of GitHub. So I just went into my profile and pressed the new button for creating a new repository. So in here, I'm going to give it a name. In here, I'm going to say YouTube course. I usually start my repository names with YouTube course so that I know it's basically a course that I've created on YouTube. Then I'm going to say free full stack course, and let's call it backend. Okay, maybe Django backend, Django backend. Okay, so that's the name that I assign to this repository. You don't necessarily have to use the same name. And also GitHub, since all the repository names are unique per user, you can actually use the exact same name that I'm using. So it doesn't necessarily have to be unique across all users. So YouTube course, free full stack course, Django backend. You can even call it just backend if you want to under your profile. It's completely up to you. Okay. Then I'm going to go in here and say this is the backend code for a free full stack course on YouTube. I usually put a link in here as well to the course. So this may be actually something that we could go ahead and do. So I'm just going to press a button here on my Stream Deck. Let's go to, I wonder if we can just go to playlists. And if you go to playlists, here we have the free full stack course in here. Okay. So if you go in here, here's the link to the entire playlist, basically. So I'm just going to copy that link and place it right here. So we have the link to the playlist as well. I'm going to leave this as public at the moment because, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be private. I have no reason to make this private repository at the moment. And but you will also know that, I mean, before I say that it doesn't have to be private, if you're creating this for yourself, you probably actually want it to be private. And the reason behind that is that just to get started, we're actually going to put our PostgreSQL's credentials in that repository because we need to basically log into Postgres. But since everything upon this up to this point in this course has been publicly available on YouTube, and I've actually mentioned what database we were creating on Postgres, what the password for the user logging into the database is. Since everything has been public so far and the password's pretty much just full stack course, I have no reason at the moment for me in this course to make this particular repository private. But if you're creating it for yourself and you have like a sensitive piece of data and your password is private to you, I actually suggest that you sitting at home or anywhere watching this course, please make this repository for yourself private. And I'm going to initialize this repository with a README file. And let's go to the git ignore. And in here, I'm just going to say Python in the list. So it adds the default git ignore for Python. And I like the MIT license. So let's just go and use the MIT license in here. Then I'm going to say create repository. Okay. So you can see now we have a repository in here with some information. As you can see, the title is there, and we have a README file. And also there's one commit in this repository, so we don't actually have to initialize the repo when we clone it. Great stuff. Now that we have the repository, we could go ahead and clone it. So let's just go into coding here, and I like to clone with Git. So I'm going to copy this with SSH, okay? And let's go to terminal, and I'm going to say cd dev. And that's, I'm just going to basically find a folder on my computer where I usually like to, clone projects. Okay, so let's just go to dev and see if we can find if you have Django, Python perhaps. Let's go in there and let's go to, do we have clones or forks or something? Let's see what we have in here. We have projects. Okay, so let's go to projects, cd Python. Okay, so this is the folder that I'm in right now, dev projects Python. And let's see what we have in here. We have testing Python. So let's actually in projects, I wonder if we have Django as well. And we do actually have Django. So let's see what we have in here. We have quite a lot of stuff. We have backend, chat, clones, notes, study about testing Django. So I wonder if we can actually go and create a specific folder in here. I can see we have clones as well. So we have this folder that I'd already cloned from before. So I think we can delete that one. So let's say rmrf YouTube. You don't have to do this, but all we have to do is just to end up in a folder where we want to clone that code. Okay, so now I'm in dev projects Django clones, and I'm just going to say git clone and then paste the URL that we were given here. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in here. Git clone, and then let it do its job. So I can see now that this has been cloned on my computer. So if I say lsla, I have this YouTube course folder available. So let's go in there. Now we're in our backend code, basically. Okay. So if you look in here, git log, we see we have one commit, which is the initial commit for our repository. Okay, great stuff. Now that we're here, we need to go ahead and activate our Python version. Up to this point in this course, we've done a lot of preparation work, so I'm not going to go through all of that again. But by this time, you have to have PyEnv installed on your computer, whether you're on Linux, Windows, or Mac. And these instructions are available in the free full stack courses playlist. So I've already provided these instructions. If you happen to have jumped into this chapter directly, I suggest that you go back to those previous chapters and install PyEnv as well on your computer. Okay. So now that we have PyEnv, let's go ahead and actually activate the version 3.10.0. I know some of you watching this course may actually have installed another version of Python on your computers. So if we say PyEnv versions, you can see the various versions that are available on my system. I have 3.10 and I have 3.8.10, 3.8.10, and that's it really. So you may have 3.10.4. Or you may be watching this course 2 years from now, and you may have 3.10.6 or whatever. So in that case, I suggest that you go ahead and activate the version that you'd planned to use for this course. But I can only guarantee that the code that we're going to run is going to work with 3.10x, meaning that 3.10.1, 3.10.2, etc. Okay. So let's go ahead and say PyEnv local 3.10.0. And if we then say lsla in here, you can see PyEnv created a file in here called Python version. Okay, so this is a file that tells PyEnv that we're going to use 3.10.0. So if I say in here Python --version, it's 3.10.0. Okay, so that is the version that we basically want for our backend code at the moment. So that's great. Now we have our Python version set. Now we need to create something called a virtual machine. And a virtual machine, it might sound a little bit scary, a little bit too technical as well, but it's really not. A virtual machine in the world of PyEnv and Python is a set of instructions to Python interpreter, telling it what tools and what snapshot of Python we're using for this current project. Because for instance, I'm also an iOS developer, but usually when you're doing iOS development, you only have one Xcode version installed on your computer, or maybe just a release version of Xcode and a beta version of Xcode, and that's all you have. But then if you want to switch between these two, you need to do it globally. So you need to do an Xcode XC select, I think it's called. And then you set your version of Swift tool chains, everything iOS tool chain globally. But with Python, you can actually do it locally or per project, per folder. You decide that. And a virtual machine is really just that you tell Python that, hey, I want to create a set of tool chains for myself, and I want to specify the version of all of those tools. Like I want pip to be this version, I want Python to be this version, I want this and that to be that version. And also when you drag in your dependencies, then you can store them inside of your virtual environment as well. So for those of you who are backend developers with Node.js, for instance, or have used NPM, it's kind of like an NPM repository. It's kind of like an NPM folder where you store all your dependencies. That is called a virtual environment when you're coming to the Python world. Okay, so we need a virtual environment for our projects so that we can from this point on, when we install a dependency, for instance, for our backend, that dependency is going to be stored inside that virtual environment. And whenever we switch folders, so when we go in terminal from this folder to another and then back into this folder, then that virtual environment is going to be activated directly, and then all your dependencies are going to be set and your Python version is going to be set. So that's why we need a virtual environment, and we're going to do that with PyEnv. So let's go ahead now with the Python version set correctly to 3.10.0. Let's go ahead and create our virtual environment. So we're going to say PyEnv, virtualenv, and then we're going to call it drf backend. So this is going to create a new virtual environment with the current Python version, which is 3.10, and drf means Django REST Framework dash backend. So this is the designated name of our backend, and I actually suggest that you use the same name simply to avoid confusion later in this particular chapter and also the chapters that follow. You're free to choose your own name, but then anytime I say drf backend, if you have to activate it or deactivate it, whatever, you need to substitute that name in your head with the name that you're trying to give to your backend project. So just for the sake of simplicity, I think it's actually best that we choose drf backend, all of us watching this course. So just also know that this is not the name that is going to be placed, for instance, inside this repository. This is the name that we're locally giving to our virtual machine on our computer. Okay, and this is going to be stored by PyEnv locally on your computer. So PyEnv, virtualenv, and then drf backend. So let's press enter here. So this is going to go create our virtual environment for us. Okay, so now that you created your virtual environment, you need to know that PyEnv actually stores this locally on your computer. So you can actually say PyEnv versions. So your drf backend, let's see where it is, 3.10 here. drf backend, as you can see in here. So this is a virtual environment that we've created for our project. Okay, so it's using the version 3.10.0, and it is actually a version officially in PyEnv. So just like you would be able to enable 3.10.2 or 3.10.0, you can actually enable drf backend anywhere in your computer now, because it's actually an official Python version from what PyEnv is concerned. Okay, so now that we have that version, this is a very important part of this chapter and this course. Now that we have that virtual environment and Python version from what PyEnv is concerned, we have to activate it. And activating is just a process of telling PyEnv that, hey, we want to be inside this virtual environment now. Any communication with Python and any of our dependencies need to be relative to this particular Python installation. So if you miss this part, you could have a lot of errors in the future. So we're now going to activate the virtual environment, telling Python that any operation related to Python or our dependencies or pip is relative to this particular virtual environment. So let's go ahead and activate it. So we're going to say PyEnv activate, and then we're going to say drf backend. Okay, and it says prompt changing will be removed from future release. Okay, that's fine. And this is just a warning that PyEnv is throwing out there. It's not actually a warning; it's like a verbose information saying that virtual machines, because whenever you historically, whenever you've enabled virtual machines for Python, you've been getting this prompt changing here. You can see now my prompt has actually changed. So if I clear the screen, you can see if I go in here, anything I do, my prompt has like a prefix that says the name of the virtual environment, which is the RF backend. But this is supposedly going to be removed in future versions of PyEnv, so you won't really know if you're in a inside a virtual environment or not. But that was just a verbose information, so we don't have to do anything about it. But if you see this prompt change, you know that you've activated your Python version correctly. Or sorry, you've activated your virtual environment, okay? Just like you can activate a virtual environment, you can also deactivate it. So you can just go and say PyEnv deactivate, and you can see your prompt changes to what you were using before. So if I in here say PyEnv versions, you can see that at the moment we're on the 3.10.0 version that was set by our PyEnv local. But if we switch to PyEnv activate the RF backend and then say PyEnv versions, you can now all of a sudden see that we're actually on this PyEnv virtual environment, which is called DRF backend. That's exactly what we want. Okay, so that's really good. Now, when you're working with your backend code, you always need to ensure that you're using your virtual environment. And what that really means is that even if you start editing this code, for instance, in Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio Code also has a built-in terminal, as you know. So a very typical error that I've seen developers make is that they go into Visual Studio Code, open a folder that has that is, for instance, this courses folder that has a virtual environment, and then they forget to actually activate that virtual environment in Visual Studio Code's terminal as well. And then they start issuing some commands in the terminal, and the Python interpreter starts complaining, saying the versions don't match, your dependencies aren't there, and all of a sudden you start wondering what you've done wrong. And that is one of the typical causes of issues. So as long as you're working with this backend code, you need to always ensure that you're using your virtual environment, meaning that you're bringing in all your dependencies, your Python version, your pip, everything with that, okay? So as we go ahead and use Visual Studio Code with our backend, and you may be closing Visual Studio Code, going to bed, maybe even, I don't know why you would want to close Visual Studio Code when you go to bed. You probably sleep better if you have Visual Studio Code open. And then if that happens, if for instance, for some reason your computer shuts down and then you have to start up Visual Studio Code again, you always need to ensure that you've activated your virtual environment as long as you're working with the backend code, okay? Great stuff. Now that we're in this folder, we're actually going to get started with Django. So Django is a dependency that you can bring in into your code, into your virtual environment. So what we're going to do is go ahead and install it with pip, okay? So package installer for Python, pip, and we're going to say install Django. All right. And that's fantastic. Okay. Now that we've installed that, we also can go ahead now and upgrade pip. As you can see, we got this warning now. It says we're using a version of pip that is a little bit older than the actual version that's out there. And it says you should consider upgrading. I'll see if I can bring this screen a little bit higher so you can see it as well. You should consider upgrading via this command. So for me, I'm just going to copy paste this and let it do its work. Okay. So let it upgrade pip as well. Now it's happy, and we've installed Django and also the latest version of pip as well. Now, as we get into more Python development throughout this course, you will probably get to know about a code formatter called Black. And officially, I'm going to use Black for this entire course for when we're doing the backend development. Black is just an open source code formatter, and it's very well integrated into Visual Studio Code. And when we then start saving, for instance, our backend files, and when we're writing code in Django later, then by pressing Command S on Mac or Control S on Windows and Linux for saving your files, your Python files, Black will automatically format your code. So it's an important part of this chapter and this course as well. So let's go ahead and install it. Pip install Black. Okay, and this installed Black for us without a problem. Great stuff. Okay, now we're going to get to the interesting part. Now that we have Django installed in our virtual environment, we have access to a tool called Django Admin. And Django Admin is it's a very important tool for actually getting started with Django projects. But as you then get into the development of your backend, you're probably not going to use Django Admin so much, but you still, from time to time, are going to go back to it. So now what we're going to do is to actually create our project. Okay, so this is important because if you look inside our folder right now, we just have Git related stuff and license and README files. We don't have our project yet. So let's go ahead in here and say Django admin. And then we're going to say start project. And we're going to call our project backend. But we're going to basically spread this project in the current folder. And the way to do that is that you do a dot in here. What this dot does is that instead of Django admin creating your backend inside a folder called backend and in there creating another folder called backend, it just removes that first outer folder and spreads the contents of your backend in the current directory. Otherwise, you will end up with backend / and then the rest of the files. But if you do the dot at the end of this command, then you end up just with backend and then / everything will be inside that folder. Okay, so let's say Django admin start project backend space dot, and then we're going to go ahead and let it do its work. Okay, so you can now see if I say lsla in here, I can see a folder called backend, and we also have a new file in here called manage.py, which is a very important file, as you'll get to know about it soon. So let's go into this backend folder and then do an lsla in here, and you can see we have some settings, URLs. We're not going to play with this file. We're not going to play with this file and not this file for the module either. So we're probably just going to play sometimes with this URLs and settings.py file. I'm going to go back now to the root. Okay, so I'm at the root of this courses folder. And just lsla. So now you have to have this backend folder and the manage.py file as well in there. Okay. So what we need to do now is to actually turn on our server. So we're going to just give it a test run. Okay. And the way to do that is to say Python manage.py, and then we're going to say run server. Okay. So let it do its work, and now you can see a message in here that says our server is now running inside this address. So I'm just going to copy that and go to Safari in here, open a new tab, and you should now have this beautiful rocket that's taking off. Is a never-ending takeoff of a rocket, which is a symbolic animation for Django. So if you've done everything right, your Django server should now be running locally successfully on port 8000. That's the default port, which you can actually edit and change if you want to. Otherwise, this is what you should be seeing now in your browser by running this command, as you saw earlier in here. Python manage.py run server. Okay, so actually that's a little congratulations to all of us for getting this far. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead to stop the server with Control and C. And I'm going to stop the server. So I'm back in here. So nothing is blocking my terminal now. The server isn't running. And I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code now. So I'm going to open this folder in Visual Studio Code by saying code dot. And we've already done this actually in previous chapters of our of this course, in that we have installed the terminal extensions for Visual Studio Code. I think in Linux, and in Linux, you probably don't have to do that. I forgot if we had to do that in Linux or not, but that should be available in the video that we created for Linux. But in Mac, you need to do that. So if you go and say shell command, install code command in path, that would basically allow you to type code dot in the terminal. Okay. So we've already gone through that. I don't have to explain that again. All right. So now we have Visual Studio Code available in here, and it's open our folder for us. I'm actually going to close it because I think it opened maybe an old folder or something, just to be sure, because I had already created a folder with the same name and in the preparation for this course. So I just want to ensure that it's actually opening the correct folder. Great stuff. Now that we have Visual Studio Code available in here, we need to go to our terminal. And as you can see in here, let's go in here. You can see that the prompt is actually not changed really in here. So if you say PyEnv versions, you can see that we are in DRF backend, which is pretty nice actually. It says PyEnv version environment variable, so it's using the DRF backend in here, but it's not using this DRF backend virtual environment. So let's go ahead and just enable our virtual environment just in case. So we're going to say PyEnv activate DRF backend. Okay, and I think it's already activated. So Visual Studio Code was intelligent enough to activate the virtual environment for me, denoted by this little asterisk next to the DRF backend. But you never know, and depending on the Visual Studio Code's version or your operating system, this may or may not be the case for you as well. But it's just always safer to just activate your virtual environment yourself as well. Okay, so then we're good to go. So if we go to manage.py file in here, let's go ahead and open manage.py. Let's see, manage.py. Now, sometimes, depending on whether Visual Studio Code is intelligent enough or not, or your editor is intelligent enough, you may or may not get some errors in here. So let's actually go ahead into settings.py. Let's see if we're getting some errors in here. But sometimes inside folder files like this, like the settings.py, you may get some errors telling you that, oh, some imports can't be found, and some settings can't be, basically some imports can't be found. And in order to fix that, you need to ensure that you've selected the correct interpreter. And what that really means is that Visual Studio Code sometimes doesn't understand that you're inside a virtual environment, so it cannot connect your local Python files to Django, because inside our virtual environment we've installed Django as a dependency, just like you would install an npm package as a dependency. So you need to just tell Visual Studio Code which Python interpreter you're using and where that is located. And the way to do that is by pressing Command-Shift-P on Mac or Control-Shift-P on Linux and Windows, like this, and then you say select interpreter, and then you basically in here tell Visual Studio Code which Python interpreter it should use. And in here you can see the pre-selected one was this DRF backend, and that's exactly what I need. So I'm just going to leave it like that. But if that's not the one that is selected for you, then I suggest that you go ahead and actually select the correct one in the list so that your import problems will go away, if that's the case for you. Okay. So you may also get a prompt in here telling you that that it's recommended that you install a linter called MyPy, and we're not actually going to do that in this course. So we're not going to use MyPy as our linters. It may be a little bit tempting to do that because you're just getting the prompt from Visual Studio Code, but I suggest that you don't do that. Otherwise, we're going to get a little bit of a clash between Black and MyPy. Okay. So let's go in here now, select Black as our formatting provider. And the way to do that is just to press Command-Shift-P in Visual Studio Code on Mac or Control-Shift-P on Windows and Linux. And then we're going to go and say Workspace Settings as a JSON file in here and open it. Okay. And let's go in here and create a new setting in here. We're going to say Python formatting provider. And in here we're just going to use Black as our formatting provider. Okay, so let's go ahead also and tell Visual Studio Code that we want Visual Studio Code to automatically format our Python files as we save them, so we don't have to issue any linter formatter manually. Okay, so let's go in here and say editor format on save, and then let's set this value to true. Okay, just like that. And this is pretty much all we had to do for the settings of our workspace. And you can see these settings will be saved inside a hidden folder here, .vscode settings.json. All right. Great stuff. So in this course, as you may know, well, as you probably actually already know, we're going to use PSQL. So Postgres, and then there is a bridge that has been created between Python and Postgres, and you can see it, the name at the bottom of the screen, scicop g2, and this is a dependency that we have to install for our application. So let's bring up terminal in here and just say pip install scicop g2. And also let's just make sure that we're in the virtual environment as well. So we probably are, but I like to check that. So let's say PyEnv versions, and we can see we're in DRF backend, so that's really good. So let's say pip install scicop g2, okay? And this bridge is going to then allow us to talk to PostgreSQL from within our Django application. All right. So now what we need to do is just to connect our backend to our local installation of PostgreSQL. So let's go ahead and open our settings file, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, settings.py. All right. I'm going to close the terminal in here. And then if you scroll down a little bit inside this settings.py, you will see a section in here called databases. And there's a default database at the moment is using an engine of Django DB backend SQLite, which is a default database provider for new Django applications. But we're not going to use SQLite. We're actually going to use PostgreSQL. So let's go ahead in here and actually change this engine. Now, I also have GitHub Copilot installed on my computer. I'm experimenting quite a lot with Copilot, so it is very possible that Copilot is going to give me the correct suggestions on what to write in here. But if the suggestions are wrong, I'm just going to ignore them. But if the suggestions are right, I'm just going to take them. Okay. So the engine in here, we don't want SQLite. I actually want PostgreSQL. So I'm just going to say engine. Let's go change this in here and then say db backends dot. I'm going to say PostgreSQL, and it gave me a suggestion. And then I'm going to say scicop g2. Okay. So that's the engine that we're going to use. Let me also make the font a little bit bigger so you see it better as well. Okay. So it is a bit of typing, but just ensure that you got the name correct in here. Okay. So as we're doing this, as we're changing the engine, what we also need to do is just to ensure that the password for our PostgreSQL user is correct. So let's go ahead and log into PSQL in here. I'm going to bring up terminal. And let's say PSQL, and then we're going to say with a user of full stack course. So this is gonna connect me with a user full stack course to a database called full stack course as well. Okay, so that's really good. This is a connection information. You can see full stack course, and we've already gone through PostgreSQL. So there is a crash course available for PostgreSQL inside the playlist for the free full stack course. So you're very, very encouraged to actually watch that before you jump into this chapter. So if you haven't watched that, I really suggest that you go back and watch that chapter. Very important. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and set a default password for our full stack course user in here using alter user full stack course. Let's make sure we write it correctly. And then we're going to say with password, and then we're going to say full stack course. Okay. A semicolon, and the alter role actually went through correctly as well. So we have full stack course in here. Okay, so what this does is it just sets a password for that user, because by default, maybe that user doesn't even have a password. But when we connect it to Django, we are expected to provide a password. Okay. Now, since we're going to provide the password for our full stack course PSQL user inside this settings file, we're going to check this file as well. This is going to be checked into GitHub. So you need to be careful with that. And we're going to later go through actually the best practices for doing this. You should never check in your passwords into any GitHub repository. And when we then later go into deploying our Django application, then we're going to talk about how we manage passwords, to different databases with what is called secret management. So, but for now, we're going to just to make things easier for the sake of simplicity, check in this user's name and password into our GitHub repository. And that's the reason it is important that you make your GitHub repository private, and also keep in mind that you should never, in other circumstances, push in your code into any GitHub repository. Okay. So, but since this course is publicly available, username and password, everything is public, we're just gonna go ahead and check it for me at least as the instructor, okay? So we have a user called full stack course with a password full stack course. And then what we can do is just to quit PSQL. So we don't have to be there anymore now that we've set the password, okay? So I should have actually brought up this little label a little bit before, but you have to quit PostgreSQL's prompt with \Q. Let's now go back to Visual Studio Code and complete the settings for our database connection. In here, you can see it's providing the name for me. This is GitHub Copilot telling me what to write. And I actually think it's very fitting, so I don't have to ignore it. So I'm just going to say, okay, go ahead and give me the name. Now, the name is the username, the PSQL username. And you should be familiar with this by this point because we've gone ahead and done this quite a lot in the previous chapters. The name is full stack course. Okay, so this is the name of the user in PSQL. And then after providing the name, so let's see in here, database name, that's great. The name is set. Let's go ahead and actually sorry about that. I believe that this name is not the username. This name is the name of the database. So if I mention that this is the username is incorrect. This is the name of the database. But since the name of the database, the username, and the password are all full stack course, it could get a little bit confusing, and I was myself confused a little bit. But this name is the name of the database, okay? And right now, then we're going to go ahead and provide the username. So let's go in here and type user. And the user is also full stack course, okay? So after doing that, we're going to go ahead and set the password as well. So you can see it's going to tell me passwords in full stack course as well. GitHub Copilot is very smart. It actually was like, okay, everything's full stack course. So this also full stack course. I really like that. So now that that is done, we need to also tell it that the host is localhost. So it figured that out as well. So we need to set host to localhost, okay? Also, we're going to go ahead and use a port, which is the PSQL default port, which is 5432. So let's see if it can figure that out. Absolutely, it figured that out. So with these settings, really, you should be good to go. You should be able now to run your server as well without a problem with these settings. Okay. So now that we've done that, we're going to go to Visual Studio Code's terminal. Let's just see that. Oops. Let's go back to the terminal and say PyEnv versions. Let's just make sure we're on our DRF backend's virtual environment. And after doing that, what we need to do is to do something called making migrations. Now, it's a little bit too early to talk about migrations and what they actually mean, but since all of you are technical, I can just maybe explain and touch upon that topic a little bit. When you're creating a Django application, when you're working with your Django applications, you're working quite a lot also with your data models. And these data models are all going to have to be translated from Python code that you're writing, because when you're working with Django, you don't actually have to write SQL code. When you're creating your data models and objects with Python, Django has a way of understanding how you write your Python code and how it has to translate that to SQL. So as your project evolves and you change your Python code, Django also has to understand the changes that you're making to your database models, and it has to be able to apply those changes to the database with SQL commands. So it's actually going to say, okay, this column was renamed from foo to bar, and it's going to write some SQL code for that. And those SQL codes, every time you make your changes and you actually are ready to make those, commit those changes are called migrations in Django world. So, and as I mentioned, I'm not going to go too much into that, but just know that migrations are things that are affecting your database in a sense that you change a column, or you maybe change the data type of a column, or you added a column, remove the column, etc. Okay, so by default, when you create your Django application, there are some migrations already created for you, which are going to go ahead. Actually, no, by default, there are no migrations, I believe. But you actually have to apply the changes that Django has created for you, or the default initial state of your database. So And that was the warning that we got when we actually started our server from scratch using Python manage.py and then run server. We can have a look at that actually. Let me do that run server one more time. Let's go in here. Oops. Control R, I believe. Run server. Okay. And have a look at that. And you can see in here, it says you have 18 unapplied migrations. Your project may not work properly until you apply the migrations. And then it says, run this command, Python manage.py migrate. Okay, so you don't have to apply your migrations, but you have to, you don't have to make your migrations, but you actually have to apply them. But it's always safer if you ask any Django developer, they will give you two commands to run. You always have to first make your migrations with make migrations, and then you have to run your migrations. So let's do make migrations just to be sure. So let's say Python manage.py make migrations. And also don't worry if this is a little bit too abstract at the moment. You'll get to know more about this as we develop our backend, okay? And I'm imagining right now we're just gonna get a message saying there are no migrations, so no changes detected. That's good. After doing that, let's actually apply our migrations with the migrate command. So Python manage.py, and then we're gonna say migrate, okay? Boom. Now, we got a lot of stuff printed to the screen. And if you're seeing these OK messages in here, it's actually a very significant point in this chapter and in this course, because what this means is that you have created your PostgreSQL database successfully, and you've connected your Django installation successfully also to PostgreSQL. And we're gonna prove that soon. So if you're seeing these OKs, then it's a very, very significant step, okay? So let's go back to PostgreSQL. In here, I'm going to say PSQL user full stack course. And if we say in here connection, we see that we're connected to a database called full stack course in here. Okay, and what we can do is to have a look at all the tables that are inside this database. Since we manually haven't added any tables into this database, any tables added into this database at this point should have come from Django. Okay, so let's say \dt, and you can see there's lots of tables in here: auth group, auth user, Django admin, and all these tables were actually created by us running this particular command in here, Python manage.py migrate. Okay, so what this command really did is that it went to the default settings that we had in here, looked at the engine, it understood that we're using PostgreSQL, it understood the name of the database, the user, password, it tried to log into that database with this information, and then and also the host and the port, and applied all the migrations and added all these tables to PostgreSQL. So it is a very, very significant step in this chapter, and as I said, in this entire course as well. Okay, so that's really good now that we're there. So we can just leave this prompt as it is and go back to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to clear the prompt, and let's go ahead and commit our code up to this point. So I'm going to go ahead and say git commit am, which is going to add all the files as well. And then we're going to say step 1. And I can see actually there's lots of folders in here that weren't committed. So let's say git add -- all, and then say git commit. Do we have any commits with step 1 already? No. And say let's git commit am step 1 in here. Okay, so if we have a look at our logs, we can see we have step 1 in here. And I can actually push these changes to our repository as well, because this is a real public GitHub repository. And if you have any doubts about the code that you've written, for instance, and if you want to just check that against anything, you can just go ahead and check out the code that I've now publicly published to GitHub as well, and compare your code with mine. But to be honest with you, there is not so much code. We just changed these things in our settings. Py file, just if you want to double check that. Okay. Now, I just want to say a huge congratulations to all of us for getting this far. Now we have a backend set up, and we can run it with Python manage.py run server. And we're going to get a lot more into Django now that we have a running backend. So again, congratulations, and see you in the next chapter.